New questions. What experiential activities would you suggest to assist white men in recognizing unintentional bias? Love that one. Verna Myers, I'll pop it into the chat. Have not seen this? Verna Myers, YouTube. Has a 17-minute TED Talk that I found 2 days ago, and I sent it out to a group of whites that I do a white affinity space with, because someone said, Kathy, your work is useful to a point to help us recognize our racist attitudes. So that's one thing. You could Google just implicit bias and see if anybody has lists of common implicit bias around sexism, racism, gender identity, classism. I have a document if you want to email me. Again, I'll put my email in the chat, Kathy at drkathyhuber.com. I have and you can get them online. If you get on my website, you can download my book, But I'm Not Racist. And then the links either in the back of the book or I have it listed to these type of handouts. And one of the handouts is 41, I'm about to expand it because I've thought of 8 to 10 more, common racist attitudes and behaviors that whites have. So that's what I'm thinking about, is worksheets that people can do on their own. When do they see these, that other people have these attitudes and behaviors, and when have they had them? And in my book, But I'm Not Racist, I talk about how I run affinity spaces, how to use that activity, as well as the handout tells a little bit how to use it. But if you can find some of that thing, those, and or I just made the suggestion in a call earlier today, what if you get folks in the marginalized identities in that organization or any organizations to say, here are the kind of unintentional bias that people have in this organization. So you could do a focus group just of folk of color, focus group of people identify as female, cisgender, of folks that identify as genderqueer, gender nonconforming, trans, folks that are lesbian, gay, bisexual, folks that grew up and or are currently living in working class, working poor. What are the classist dynamics that happen? So you could actually gather some of that from the organization or people you know, create your own list as a working document and have people just, ooh, I've seen this, and tell stories, and then and then when they've done it. So that's one thing. Verna Myers talks about kind of how the title is something about moving beyond implicit bias. And so I'm going to listen to it because beyond recognizing awareness, where we learned it, how we still react out of it, and what's the negative impact when people still react out of unintentional, unmeaning, implicit bias, to feel kind of the negative impact we have and kind of that, I don't want to be that person anymore. How do I change? So what can I do differently? I teach people to interrupt. I think it's in the book. If not, it's in some of the handouts that you might be able to find of mine online or email me. Some questions like, where did you first learn that? And how does it serve you? How could you change that thought? So people of color are hired because of affirmative action. Is that only true for people of color, or are white people hired based on, now I want to be careful, affirmative action is a whole different system, but the inference is folks of color are not qualified, quote, when they're hired, these racist comments that are in most every search committee. And so asking the question, is it true? Is it true that folks of color that we've hired do not have competence? Is it true that every white person we've hired has been fully competent when we've hired them? And that's when whites will kind of go. So did you notice how I switched it? So you take the racist thought and say, is it true? And actually, that is true for whites. We have hired whites who were friends of people. We've hired whites because we thought we'd be comfortable with them. We've hired nepotism. We've hired people that were not ready for the job, and we moved them to another job because we didn't want to let them go, but we gave them, or if we did let them go, we gave them a huge package. So come to my workshop that I'm doing this fall on white affinity spaces, but more about unintentional bias. The cycle of socialization, which is talked about, I'm pretty sure, in this book, Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. Dr. Bobby Harrow, I'll type her name in because it spells it differently than some people may think. Cycle of Socialization. That actually is a great activity to have people just do a lot of socialization work and what were the messages around them. And the cycle of socialization is a way for people not to judge themselves as like, ooh, I shouldn't have, all that guilt and shame, but just like, here's what I learned, here's how I learned it, and then how do I work every day to not act out of those biases. Modeling that you've got bias, that you still act out of them, and how you interrupt your own bias before you speak or do something can help them realize we all have it. Something that a group did, and there was a video of it, but I don't know who did it. They would show a picture, so they have a whole picture, but they would only show about this much, and I'm putting my hands together. And they would ask people to write down what are the first impressions people might have of this person if they came to interview. And then you can fold them up, trade them, and read them aloud. So the implicit biases will come right out. And then they showed the entire picture and then gave a bio of the person. And you got information which usually challenged the quick snap biases. One way I teach about implicit bias is I went on Pinterest and Google Images and came up with, 30 different categories of difference. Maybe it was only like 20, but then just pictures. And I asked by group, who might still have some implicit bias? And then I would show people who are working in the fields picking cotton, not cotton. Well, it was probably, I would do that one. But I think it was probably, berries. So it was undocumented, or it was seasonal workers was probably the title that I had. People assumed to be undocumented. People who are larger than society says. So I did like 15 different, at least, categories of differences. Had pictures. Be sure I did race, class, gender, sexuality, for sure, and then a bunch of others, appearance. And they just kind of make a snap or a noise. Do people still have stereotypes? So first, yes, they still exist. And then you could do, so what are they? Through maybe some socialization, what did you learn or what's still out there? You could bring in clips of Disney, clips of modern, current day videos and say, what are the implicit biases in these? John Quinones, What Would You Do If? On ABC. There's some great stuff. I just put Bobby Harrow. I hadn't hit it, but it's now in the chat. The one I like is the bikes. 3 different people are shown, quote, stealing a bike, and they're actors, and one presents as an African-American man. I think first they do the white man, African-American man, around the same age, around the same size, clothing, and then a white female presenting person that people would call beautiful in a US context, generally. So that quick video, what were the biases people had, letting people talk about what they might have. There's a lot of research about names on resumes. And so you could go and get some of that research and show them that, and then have them practice with resumes and read them and then write down anonymously who they think the person is. And then what assumptions someone might have if they saw this resume. Definitely socialization is coming to me. A lifeline of 5 different identities, and who was around you when you were growing up by class? What were the messages of what were the different classes? How did you see people talk about the different classes, treat people of different classes? How do you see those same dynamics today? So I would do in depth on a topic, and then how might dynamics of class be playing out? What are some of the microaggressions under that? What are some of the implicit biases that are fueling that? And again, this language of implicit bias, you could have them take the Harvard implicit bias test. If you all don't know that, I would go do it. Implicit. Just type in Harvard implicit bias. It'll come up, and now so at last I looked, they had on different topics of difference. I remember taking the racism one, and I was kind of, what do you mean I have a negative bias towards people of color? It was a black-white one. And the truth is, I have racist attitudes towards African Americans. I try to work them every day. And so you might have them take that have them take race and at least one other. Now, they're going to critique the test, and it still might be a little jarring. So those are some of my thoughts.